Hello and welcome along. Today we're going to talk about False Astartes. What are they? Why did they need to be created? Who are the famous examples? What methods were used to create them? And what limitations did they have? So recently I did a video about Mortarion and his early years before the Emperor rediscovered him. And in that video I talked about his closest ally, friend, confidant, Callus Typhen, who went on to become first captain of the Death Guard. He was essentially Mortarion's second in command before Mortarion took over the Legion. So when he was given the command of the Death Guard, he naturally took his senior team, if you like, his senior officers from the army he had assembled on Barbarous to fight the rebellion against the overlords. And so it was very natural that someone like Callus Typhen would be taken into the Death Guard and become an Astarte. However, as the nature of these things are, most people who are senior officers within an army are not going to be 12-year-olds or younger. So what do? Well, there's three ways around this, really. And different Primarchs had different solutions to this problem, because this wasn't just a problem that Mortarion had. All of the Primarchs had to face this situation, well, nearly all of them, in how do I get my best people, the people that I have established these long relationships with, built up trust in, trained myself, etc., who are in positions of authority within my current military forces, into this new force I have command over, these legions. And one answer to that is False Astartes. So what is a False Astarte? Well, essentially, it's someone that has been augmented in other ways to give them similar abilities to an Astarte, but without having to undergo the full implantation process. Essentially, Astartes are made by giving them these organ implantations, these gene seed implants that develop certain traits and characteristics within the recruit and eventually turn them into a full Astarte with all the abilities that come with that: the enhanced speed, strength, endurance, toughness, various other little weird quirky abilities like spitting acid and gaining knowledge from drinking blood and these kind of things. But that is an extended process. It's not something that happens in one night of surgery. This happens over several years, and the prospective candidate has to go through all these steps to get to that point. And of course they generally do happen around the time of puberty. So candidates usually are rejected if they've already gone through puberty. Now, in later times, that wasn't a big problem, because the legions would set up their own recruitment processes that would find candidates very young in life, and they could induct them into the process early. And that way you got the best chance of someone surviving through the process. But in the earlier days of the Legion, particularly at these times when they were just being taken over by their Primarchs, there were a lot of people that Primarch wanted to bring in that had obviously gone through puberty already, and not just recently. I mean, many of them were full adults in their 30s, 40s, whatever, maybe even older in some cases, who had a very tiny chance of passing successfully through the implantation process without dying. Now, the process itself is always dangerous. All the legions have dangerous implantation processes, some more than others, but it's greatly increased in danger by going through it at an older age. And the older you go through it, generally speaking, the less chance you have of successfully surviving. So if you opt for the False Astarte process, what you're getting is most of the benefits of that implantation process, but much less risk. So the risk is much, much lower. You have a relatively high chance of surviving the process, but the results aren't quite as good. So it does mean that the people that get this process done have to accept that they'll never be quite as good, physically at least, as the true Astartes. And this does lead to quite a lot of problems when this process happens, because essentially the younger candidates, those who were in a junior position to these False Astartes, who are often being commanded by them as recruits, being trained by them, etc., go through their full implantation process and become Astartes, become true Astartes. They are now superior in many ways, physically at least, to their previous commanders. And that can lead to a fair bit of resentment, because they can't help but think they're better than these people that are in command of them. They can see it every day. Every training exercise they do, every time they go out onto the battlefield, they just can see their heightened perception, which is part of being an Astarte. They can tell like they're moving much more fluidly, much more naturally. They can control their armor with the black carapace interface much better than a False Astarte can. They can just do everything more easily. It just comes to them more naturally. And vice versa, from the perspective of the False Astarte, who's now commanding these people who are clearly superior to them, it often gave them a sense of inferiority, which they tended to often take quite badly, become quite bitter and resentful, and it did lead to a lot of divisions within some of the legions. One of the best examples of this is the Dark Angels. So amongst the Dark Angels, there were a lot of people who were in senior military positions, very well trusted and deeply integrated into the Order, which was the organization that controlled Caliban before being reabsorbed into the Imperium. And so there were all of these highly trained, highly capable, very experienced military officers that the Lion had. He naturally both wanted them in the Legion, but also kind of couldn't not have them in the Legion because they were very influential, very powerful on Caliban. And so he had to try and bring them in some way. And many of these people became False Astartes. And really, this is one of the first things that led to the downfall of the Dark Angels, and the big split in the Dark Angels were all of these people that are carried on from the Order and had these positions of power and respect and so on, but then were faced with this situation where they couldn't really become true Astartes because they were too old and were forever separate in the minds of the Legion. You had the older Terran legionaries who had gone through the full process, and many were very experienced as legionaries and had fought for the Imperium for decades before they came to Caliban. And then you had the young people from Caliban who were becoming true Astartes. And in between these 2 points, you had these older members of the Order who had the experience and skills of being veteran officers, but lacked the physical capabilities to match either the new recruits or the older Terran-born Astartes. And so you get this kind of division into three groups within the Dark Angels Legion. And now, of course, foremost amongst these people is Luther. And of course, Luther's relationship with the Lion will break down quite heavily, quite badly, in not too short a time after the Lion takes over the Dark Angels. However, Luther himself, despite being a False Astarte, doesn't ever seem to suffer from the problems that the other False Astartes in the Legion do. He isn't really ostracized by the members of the Legion. In fact, he's greatly admired by all members of the Legion. Really, it's only his personal problem with the Lion that causes him to be on the outside. He is very respected for his obvious abilities, his natural sort of ability to command people. He has natural huge amounts of charisma, all of the kind of things you associate with a Primarch in many ways. He has all that. He naturally has these qualities. Now, of course, he doesn't have the physical capabilities of a Primarch, and he doesn't even have the physical capabilities of a true Astarte, but no one seems to resent him for that. No one seems to look down on him or think that he shouldn't be in an elevated position within the Legion. No one questions his position as the number 2 to the Lion. No one questions that. However, as I said, they did question that to some degree with the various other False Astartes that entered the Legion. And that did lead to a division that Luther would then become a part of, obviously, over time. Now, another person that's very similar in that sense to Luther was Corphoron. He was an older member, sort of father figure to Lorgar. And when Lorgar took over the Wordbearers, Corphoron came into the Legion with him. But Corphoron was, again, like Luther, way too old to be given the full transition into becoming a true Astarte. In fact, he was probably one of the oldest people to ever enter the Legions. So he was given these various upgrades, these non-Astarte upgrades that made him roughly equivalent to an Astarte. But again, not quite. And so he was always separate, always different, and could never physically match the other Astartes, the true Astartes. Now, with Lorgar, he doesn't seem to have taken a huge number of people into the Legion from his previous life. It is clear that Corphoron is one of those cases, but there's no other obvious candidates. But there probably were. It's likely that more powerful and respected members of the priesthood were potentially drawn into the Legion as False Astartes to become the kind of first proto-chaplains, if you like. But there's no obvious known candidates. But again, with Corferon, he does suffer from this resentment from other people within the Legion. He does suffer from the fact that he always feels slightly inadequate, even though he's incredibly self-confident in other ways, externally at least. Internally, he has this gnawing fear that he's not good enough, or that he's not respected by the other members of the Word Bearers, and that does seem to affect his character. But he was already a pretty terrible person before he entered the Legion. A very good example of someone who never should have been recruited into the Legion, of course. That's another story. So there are two good examples of False Astartes. What exactly was the process to turn a normal human who couldn't become a true Astarte into someone roughly equivalent to an Astarte, which is a very, very high level of physical capability and indeed mental capability? Well, the first thing is, in the Imperium, there are people with a lot of technical knowledge, a deep understanding of cybernetics and genetics, and they use this knowledge all the time within the Imperium to create enhanced human or other enhanced forms of life that you might not truly consider human. And so, although they don't have quite the knowledge that the Emperor has, people within the Mechanicum, for example, have a great deal of knowledge in enhancing strength or endurance or reflexes and so on. So there are many examples of these. Many of the Mechanicum's own troops are gene enhanced. They're given massive stimulants, and they're given things like growth hormone and other things to make them massively bulky and strong. They might be used for combat, which they are in many cases. They might just be used as just incredibly large laborers who can lift massive, concrete blocks up and move steel girders around like they're nothing. They're useful. They exist widely within the Imperium society, these enhanced beings. There's also, of course, many cybernetic enhancements that can happen. So implants, replacement body parts, whole limbs, or even large parts of the body. This technology is also, of course, used on injured Astartes to replace missing limbs and so on. But it's also used to create Mechanicum soldiers of various types. And it can be used for a false Astarte candidate to give them something near the strength of a true Astarte. So if you combine these various enhancements, these various gene manipulation techniques, exposure to various hormones and growth stimulants and so on, and cybernetic implants, both to replace organs or to enhance them, and even to replace limbs and so on, you can build someone up to quite a considerable level, to be very strong, very tough, very resistant to injury, quick to recover from injury, and you can enhance reflexes, spatial awareness, hand-eye coordination, these kind of things. Now, if you think of people like the assassins, Imperial assassins, they are greatly enhanced to fulfill their roles. Now, they tend to focus less on strength and more on speed and reflexes and hand-eye coordination, etc., to be extremely good at killing people. But those technologies do exist. And of course, there are other ways to create super soldiers that the Emperor himself has used. The Thunder Warriors, for example. Yes, not as effective in the long run as creating Astartes. They were very powerful soldiers, in fact, stronger and in other ways superior to Astartes, but generally short-lived due to out-of-control mutations, a predisposition to cancer, it seems like, or something equivalent to that, which meant that they weren't really suitable for the long run. They also had heightened aggression and so on. But some of the techniques to make those Thunder Warriors would be very useful in creating a false Astarte. If you don't use the whole process or you modify the process, maybe you could use some of those techniques at least to add into the mix to create a false Astarte. Another thing that could happen is you do the partial implantation process. So not all of the gene seed organs are as dangerous as others to implant. Some can be done more easily, are more stable, and so on. So you might give someone some of these organs, but not all of them. And that could lead to someone being a lot like an Astarte, but not fully. And then the bits you can't do, you can fix to some extent, at least with other techniques that we've been talking about before. And so that gives you the full package. You might end up with someone quite similar to an Astarte there with that partial implantation process. Now, of course, you could argue, well, why not do this in general instead of the normal process to create Astartes if it can be done? Well, the main reason is obviously, one, the results aren't quite as good generally, and two, the process is probably, although safer, is probably more expensive to do. There are various people that can afford to buy various enhancements. So if you're a member of a powerful noble house, you could get various gene enhancements done to you. You can get anti-aging technology applied to you, which keep you alive for many hundreds of years or more. You can pretty much cure almost any problem you might have if you're rich enough in the Imperium. And so those techniques are available to obviously the military of the Imperium, but they would be unnecessarily costly. And the Imperium prefers to, when it comes to its soldiers, to use more of a, well, let's throw enough candidates at it that some of them will survive technique, rather than let's spend a lot of money on each individual candidate to make them survive. So the Emperor, of course, does create his own custodes using very high level technology of gene enhancements, which he crafts each one individually by a lot, but that's a lot of work for him personally. A lot of resources go into that process to create these ultimate super soldiers. He can't do that for everyone. That's why he comes up with the Thunder Warriors. That's why he comes up with the Astarte process, because it's a much more mass manufacturing kind of way of creating super soldiers. And so the only times you would use these techniques to create false Astartes would generally be on someone that you thought is so valuable that you need them in the Legion. And that's why it does seem to be a process that is generally done on people that were close to their Primarch at that early stages when the Primarch's taking over the legions. So really it's just a matter of balancing that. So whether it's used, why it's used, and the results you get from it are really on a scale. How much resources do you want to put into it? How much time do you want to put into it? Because if you put enough resources, the ultimate level is probably well beyond that of an Astarte, but that would be something like the technology used to create custodes. Or you could in theory give someone a completely new machine body that the Mechanicum occasionally do to people. That might take you up well beyond that of an Astarte with the right resources. But these processes would be extremely expensive and probably not worth it. Also, it would make you stand out maybe too much from the other Astartes. And one of the big reasons for doing this process of creating False Astartes was to try and really blend these candidates in to the Legion as much as possible. One of the most important things about Legions is they are brotherhoods. They are really about creating close bonds to be able to work together as a team, as soldiers, and which is one of the things that makes them different from the Thunder Warriors and the Custodes, is the way that they work together as a team, not as soldiers, as an army. And people who stand out too much from that might also be less able to fit into that group, into that team, and be accepted, which could rule out some of the more extreme ways of enhancing people. So perhaps to summarize what exactly the methods used to create these False Astartes were, well, they were whatever you could do that was available that would bring them to a level as close to a true Astarte as possible, but without spending too much resources and without making them too different from those around them. That's basically where you'll get to. Now, if we go back to the original motivation for this, where Primarchs have these close confidants or members of their military that they want to bring into the Legion with them, and they go down the route of a False Astarte. Well, what were their other options available to them? Well, there was one would be simply risking them going through the full process, despite the fact that they were overage. And this did happen. It does seem to happen a reasonable amount of time. So if we go back to Callus Typhen, he does seem to have gone through the full implantation process. One of the particularly important factors of a Death Guard is how tough they were. But before they even go through the implantation process, people on Barbarous were just incredibly tough people. They were incredibly tough people because they lived on a death world. And that's often why legions recruit from death worlds, because they make great candidates, because they've been honed by nature to create very resilient people. Now, of course, as I speculated in my previous video, I also think it's likely that Typhon, being half Overlord, was potentially half alien, and that may well have helped him get through the process at an older age. Or even if the Overlords aren't alien and there's some sort of mutant strain of human, they were particularly resistant, very resistant, able to live within this toxic fog that even Mortarion couldn't deal with at his strongest. And that would almost certainly make Typhon much more likely to be able to survive the extreme process of implantation. Now, another solution to this might be what happened to some of the Thousand Sons. So Magnus had a group of sorcerers, psychers around him who taught him on Prospero in his early days, and he took them into the Legion when he took over. And they were all adults. Many of them would have been middle-aged men, and maybe even older. And they successfully transitioned into being Astartes without apparently any real difficulty. It seems like potentially Magnus achieved this by using his own power, great psychic power, to manipulate their bodies in some way, probably at a biochemical level, to get them through the process. And they came out as full, true Astartes, fully functional, with no problems. And so if you're lucky enough to have Magnus as your Primarch, that's perhaps the best way to get through this process. And Ammon, who is essentially Magnus's closest confidant, his equerry throughout the Great Crusade, definitely was a beneficiary of this, of being taken into the Legion at a much older age than would really be possible under normal circumstances, and doing it without seemingly any problems. So although it's not confirmed that Magnus actually did this, it is highly probable that he did. Of course, the Thousand Sons do have people that specialize in biomanipulation, essentially using psychic powers, that allows them to become extremely good apothecaries who can heal people from fatal wounds very easily, or perform highly dangerous forms of surgery to remove parasites living in someone's brain, remove them from their body without killing them, etc. They are very capable of doing this kind of stuff. So if they can do that, they probably can help a candidate through implantation, despite the problem of being too old. The last example I'll give is the method that the Space Wolves used, which is just do it anyway. So you've got a bunch of guys, probably middle-aged men, who have proven themselves as great warriors, have become trusted allies of Leman Russ, and he takes over the Space Wolves, and he just takes them with him. Like, there's supposed to be several hundred of these men who are his closest retinue, who would become his first Wolf Guard. These men just went through the process, despite the fact that it should have killed them all. Most of them got through it. And this probably just comes down to, one, again, Fenris being a death world, so the candidates are a very, very high caliber in terms of natural toughness, resistance to suffering. And two, obviously, these men had become his personal retinue because of just how impressive they were, even amongst the other people on Fenris. So they were the best of the best in terms of physical candidates. So despite being too old for the process, they were much more likely to be able to get through it than anybody else, or an average person at least. And so this is your other method. You just do it anyway and hope that you're just incredibly resistant and you get through it. And that does seem to have worked for them. Now, of course, not all of them got through it. That's just the price you pay. If you want to join the Space Marine Legion, you know that there's a good chance you're going to die on the way through the process, even if it isn't from the implantation process. Just training accidents happen all the time. People or just fall below the standard and just get disappeared. Many legions openly kill their recruits if they fail in anything. So it's not a particularly big deal if someone dies during the implantation process, because high casualty rates are generally expected anyway. And so just throwing more bodies at the problem generally works. Even in this extreme case of people being way too old, if just enough of them do it, you're still going to get people come through the other side anyway. So there is no guarantee of death. And so if you're just strong-willed enough to push yourself through this process, you might just be able to get out the other end. So there you go. Can you think of any other candidates for being False Astartes? There aren't any other ones I can think of who are specifically named as False Astartes, but there probably are others that stand out for being probably too old to have undergone full implantation when they entered the Legion. And these will probably mostly be close friends and followers of the various Primarchs when they first took over the Legion. So if you're anyone you can think of, put them in the comments.